So this is our chapter on sex and gender. We're going to start with a couple of definitions because often the words sex and gender and a lot of these terms are used interchangeably. So gender typing is the process by which children acquire the values, motives, and behaviors considered appropriate for their gender and their particular culture, so how they learn to be masculine or feminine. Gender-based beliefs are ideas that differentiate males and females. Gender identity is your perception of yourself as either male or female. Just a couple more. Gender role preferences are a desire to have certain gender-typed characteristics. Gender stability is the factor of understanding that males remain male and females remain stable. Remain female and that's stable over time. And then gender constancy is the awareness that superficial alterations in appearance or activity don't alter gender. So if a boy puts on a dress, understanding that he's still a boy. Then finally, gender stereotypes are beliefs that members of a culture hold about kind of acceptable attitudes, interests, activities for males and females. And gender roles are the behaviors that are actually exhibited by typical males and females in a given culture. So these are kind of how we actually play out the gender stereotypes. Okay, so we'll talk in this chapter a bit about the differences between men and women or males and females. And it's really important to note that the characteristics of males and females overlap, and most of the differences that we see are quite small. So in almost every characteristic, we see these overlapping bell-shaped curves. And while you can see, like this figure shows that on average, in this case, females score higher than males, you can see that the difference between the vertical lines is about 80% of one standard deviation. But what you see is there's a good number of individuals who are underneath the bell-shaped curve, which means that there's a good amount of overlap between these traits. So generally when we talk about differences, while we may see significant differences in the averages, there are always individuals who go the other direction. Okay, so in terms of some of the behavioral differences we see in childhood, girls are physically more mature than boys. They tend to be more oriented towards faces and make more eye contact. They tend to have better verbal skills, be more emotionally competent, and show more intimacy in social interactions and friendships. In contrast, boys tend to be more advanced in terms of muscular development and heart size. They usually do better at activities involving strength and motor skills. They're better at visual spatial tasks and more physically active. And they're often concerned with dominance rather than friendship. And so they're more competitive. But there are always exceptions. So there are going to be girls who are more competitive than the average boy. There will be boys who will be less competitive. And so we always have to remember that there's a lot of individual variability. By about 18 months, we start seeing differences in terms of these preferences for gender-typed toys. So you can see in the figure, the blue is boys looking times, and the gray is girls. And what you can see is by 18 months, boys are looking more at vehicles and girls are looking more at dolls. And so we'll talk about some of the reasons that might have happened, but those stereotype toy preferences generally are pretty stable. There's some indication that these preferences are broadening. So girls are just as likely as boys to ask for bikes or sports equipment. Boys are just as likely as girls to request clothing and educational items. So in terms of gender-typed interests, in middle childhood, boys tend to prefer to spend more time in masculine leisure activities, so hunting, playing competitive sports, things like this. And girls tend to prefer to spend more time in stereotypically feminine leisure activities like dancing, writing, and making crafts. And boys and girls also show differences in the preferences of types of books and TV shows. What we see is that often there's this process of gender intensification that leads to a shift towards more typical gender-typed behavior patterns across the lifespan. So gender typing is kind of a dynamic process that to some extent continues across the lifespan. And so gender intensification normally happens at puberty, and it shifts individuals towards more of these gender-typical behaviors. So expressive characteristics involve kind of nurturance and concern with feelings. This is more typical in females. Instrumental characteristics are more typical of males and involve kind of task and occupation orientation. And what we find is that individuals who are more who are strongly masculine or feminine at one age tend to continue to be strongly masculine or feminine over the lifespan. And adult behavior is generally predicted from gender-typed interests in childhood. So in terms of sex differences in gender typing, we find that boys tend to be more gender typed in their play and toy choices compared to girls. So, for example, boys' preferences for gender stereotyped toys remains consistent as they get older, whereas girls' interest in gender stereotyped toys and activities decreases as they reach adolescence. So girls are more interested as they reach adolescence in less of these stereotypical characteristics. But there's a couple of reasons why boys might have these more kind of strict gender stereotypes. Part of it is that Western culture is more male-oriented, and both males and females are encouraged to do things because the male encouraged to do things that are more masculine because this is regarded as more dominant. Boys may be more pressured to conform to masculine stereotypes compared to girls, and there are certainly kind of different connotations for boys who are more feminine. Generally are seen more negatively compared to girls who are more masculine. There's less of a negative stereotype. Okay, in terms of gender stereotypes for adults, according to stereotypes, men are thought to be more independent, self-reliant, strong-willed, worldly, and strong. They're expected to kind of control their emotions, even under stress, and be able to kind of separate their feelings from their ideas. In childhood, we see this kind of coming out where boys are expected to be rough and tough and brave and like sports and video games. In contrast, women stereotypically are expected to be pretty and sociable and sensitive and sympathetic. And they're generally expected to express a lot of warmth in personal relationships and display more anxiety and suppress aggression. And in children, girls are supposed to be kind of sweet and gentle and pretty and concerned with their appearance. So if we look at how children kind of understand stereotypes, children are aware of gender stereotypes from a very early age. So 2-year-olds look longer, which tells us that they were surprised when they see pictures of a man doing stereotypically female things. And so from as young as 2, they've developed these expectations. And children's knowledge of stereotypes increases rapidly between the ages of 3 and 5. So I remember very vividly last Halloween when Thomas was 3, we try not to talk about things, label things as being for boys or girls, but he found this set of butterfly wings that he was like falling in love with, and we were trying to dissuade him because they were adult size and he was dragging them all over. But he asked, well, is it because they're for girls that I can't have them? And it was just this very abrupt shift when he turned 3 that he became aware of these stereotypes and that things might not be for boys or for girls. as kids are learning about these stereotypes, they become very inflexible about gender stereotyping until they're about ages 8 to 9. So there's a couple of theories about gender development and why we have gender differences. So the evolutionary theory argues that to pass from one generation to the next, individuals need to kind of have mating strategies that improve their reproductive success. So for males, what makes them more successful is being aggressive and competitive. For females, what makes them more successful are being able to provide resources and protect their offspring. And so these kind of complementary strategies have led to the gender differences that we see. There are certainly limits to these explanations, so testing these kinds of theories are difficult. They don't explain individual differences. It applies to females and males as a group. And it doesn't account for differences in gender roles that we see today that may be due to technology or cross-cultural differences. And so this doesn't necessarily explain all of the gender differences that we see. Okay. We also know, though, that there are biological factors that can influence gender development. So there are contributions of hormones to social behavior. We've seen these demonstrated in animal studies. So, for example, when pregnant monkeys are injected with testosterone, what you find is their female offspring exhibit social behavior patterns that are characteristics of male monkeys. So when they've been exposed to testosterone in utero, they engage in more rough and tumble play. And we also have seen this in human research, where when female fetuses have high levels of androgens, girls tend to exhibit more masculine behaviors and interests, so they show less interest in playing with dolls or cosmetics, and they're more kind of assertive and have attitudes towards sexuality that more closely resemble males. So those suggest that there's some kind of hormone or biological basis to this behavior. We also have found gender differences. In the brain. So researchers have found that female brains, on average, the ratio of gray matter to white matter is larger than in male brains, specifically in the social brain region. The amygdala, which we know plays a major part in processing emotions, generally women have a larger area of the brain that's associated with the amygdala, which means that women have kind of relatively more cortical area associated with that emotion regulation. We also see differences in mirror neurons, which can influence the amount of empathy we see. And so these differences in male and female brains can help explain some of the social and emotional advantages of females. So these kinds of differences that are largely due to genetics suggest that some of our sex differences may be biologically programmed or genetically programmed, and it kind of contrasts with previous research that we're going to talk about next that really argues that gender is a social construct. So in adolescents and adults, these gender-based differences are less apparent. It seems like kind of gender-linked responses to babies are affected both by biological and evolutionary programming, but we'll also talk about how they're affected by cultural programming as well. Okay, so next we're going to talk about cognitive theories, which really focus on how children's own understandings of gender and gender roles contribute to their gender typing. So one theory is the cognitive developmental theory from Kohlberg, and he basically argues that children categorize themselves into male or female on the basis of physical and behavioral cues, and then they behave in the ways that they expect to be appropriate. He argues that kids start to recognize male and females as distinct categories really in infancy. By 17 to 28 months, most kids are using gender labels but don't really understand gender identity. But by around ages 2 to 3, kids have developed a basic gender identity. They recognize themselves as either a boy or a girl. Ages 4 to 5, they get gender stability, so they understand that a male remains a male and females remain females over the lifespan. So a boy understands that he can't grow up to be mommy. And then we get to gender constancy, which has superficial changes in appearance, don't change gender. So a woman with short hair is still a woman. And so when kids, this theory really argues that when kids achieve gender constancy, so somewhere around age 6 to 7, this is really when they start gender typing. Another cognitive theory is gender schema theory. And so this argues that kids develop schemas, or kind of these native theories that help them organize and structure their experiences related to gender differences and gender roles. And so kids develop their schemas based on their personal experience, based on information from parents and peers, and cultural stereotypes. And so they use gender schemas to evaluate their own behavior. And the thought is that they selectively attend to information and remember information better that's relevant to their own sex. So they have a better memory for gender consistent versus gender inconsistent information. And this is more true for some individuals than others. So gender schematic individuals are really highly sensitive to gender information, really absorbing a lot of that, whereas gender aschematic individuals focus more on other aspects. Evidence really suggests that kind of having basic information about gender leads to kind of forming and following rules about gender. And so this gender schema theory, where kids are seeking out information about gender, is really better supported than the cognitive theory. Okay, so next we're going to move on to kind of social influences. So how do the people and things around us influence our gender development? So the first theory of this is the social cognitive theory of gender development. And so this basically is an explanation of gender role development that argues that we learn about gender through observational learning, through positive and negative feedback, and through self-efficacy. So kids learn about gender by watching children and adults of both sexes. They use that to figure out what is gender appropriate and respond with positive or negative feedback. And they shift from kind of an internal regulation of behavior from external to internal across development. So they start by being externally reinforced for gender appropriate behavior, but eventually they reinforce themselves. Another explanation of gender roles focuses on factors like kind of institutionalized constraints on opportunities for males and females in education and occupation and political spheres. And so it stresses the importance of kind of societal or cultural roles, and basically argues that these institutional constraints account for the differences in children and adults' gender-linked expectations of behavior. Okay, so next we're going to talk about specific social influences. So parents have a huge social influence on kids' gender typing. This process starts right after birth, when the parents are naming the baby, decorating the nursery, selecting gender-typed clothing and toys and activities. So even in infancy, adults tend to perceive boys and girls differently from as soon as birth. So daughters are perceived as more soft and delicate. Sons are perceived as more strong and coordinated and alert. Fathers tend to treat girls and boys differently and use different play patterns. With sons, so fathers engage in more rough and tumble play with sons. Parents in general tend to be more verbally responsive to daughters, although we see less differences in mothers compared to fathers. In terms of older children, parents tend to reward gender-appropriate play, and this is especially true with fathers and sons. and they encourage boys to a greater degree than girls to achieve and compete. So boys are encouraged to achieve and compete. They're encouraged to do this independent, where dependence is more encouraged for girls. So parents also, in addition to kind of explicitly reinforcing specific behavior, model their own behavior in terms of their attitudes and actions and lifestyles, and children pick up on this. So the more traditional parents are, the more children know about gender stereotypes. So, in general, we tend to have relatively stereotypical roles, but my husband is a stay-at-home dad, and as Thomas is talking about what things are going to be like when he grows up, he says, well, Maggie's going to be pregnant and have babies, but then he's going to stay home and take care of them while Maggie goes back to work. So in our house, that's kind of the norm. Also, he has not quite figured out that he probably won't go on to marry Maggie when he gets older. Okay. So, we've talked about fathers do play a role as well. And of course, in a traditional household, we have a mother and a father, so a model of each gender. So there's been a number of studies looking at what happens when the father is absent. And particularly for girls, the effects of a father absence tends to be delayed until adolescence. But what we see is generally those girls whose fathers are absent tend to have earlier sexual activity and higher rates of teenage pregnancy. And this is particularly true when fathers are absent early on. And this is true for boys as well, not for these specific problems, but boys tend to have greater problems if their father is absent before 5 years old. But there are other male models, peers, siblings, teachers that can really compensate for father's absences. And so, one of the criticisms of this research is, well, there are plenty of kids who are reared by, their children of lesbian couples that don't have a father in the picture that grow up perfectly happy. And so there's a number of different family arrangements in which kids can learn gender norms. It doesn't just have to be one mom and one dad. Siblings are also an important socializing agent. So younger siblings, gender typing is related to their older siblings' attributes, even more so than their parents. Kids with older siblings of the opposite sex have less stereotypical gender role concepts. Children with sisters develop more feminine qualities. Children with brothers generally develop more masculine qualities. Television and books also play a really big role. The books that children read generally portray male and female roles in stereotyped ways. TV is another place that kids get a lot of gender stereotyped, and the more TV watching kids do, the more they have these kind of stereotypical expectations. Often males on television are portrayed as aggressive and decisive and more competent, while females are portrayed as warmer and happier and more emotional. Peers also are really important because they serve as models for today's gender role standards and often are kind of the strongest influence in terms of gender typed behavior when kids are at school. And so when peers reward appropriate gender role behavior, kids are more likely to follow these behaviors. Gender segregation is one of the ways this happens, where kids start to spend more and more time with the same gender peers. So by the time they are in preschool, kids are spontaneously choosing a same gender play partner, and gender segregation tends to encourage more distinctly male and female styles. So it provides more socializing experience for girls, more competitive experience for boys. So there's a number of reasons why we might see this gender segregation. Part of it might be just the preferences for the kind of activities, right? So girls may view boys' rough and tumble play and competition as aversive, so they avoid interacting with boys. girls might also find kind of managing boys difficult. They may dislike that competition and things like that. So some of this could have to do with either earlier developed or genetically based play preferences. Schools also play a really big role. So in terms of the general culture, teachers really do a lot to create this. And at least in the beginning, the school culture generally favors girls. Female teachers tend to frown upon independent and assertive and competitive and boisterous qualities that are seen in male students. And so they tend to prefer girls who are more verbally oriented and well-behaved and more willing to follow the rules. But what we see is girls' achievement levels decline as they get older. By the time we get to college, the proportion of female underachievers actually exceeds the proportion of male underachievers. And teacher attitudes and behaviors also play a role. So teachers generally are more responsive to girls' social initiative and to boys' assertive behaviors. And so they can kind of reinforce these gender stereotype behaviors. And teachers also tend to encourage boys more than girls in mathematical pursuits. Okay, the final point is that through most of this chapter, we've focused on kind of the stereotypical masculine versus feminine characteristics. But some individuals really show characteristics of being androgynous, where they possess both masculine and feminine psychological characteristics. And there's actually a significant amount of evidence that there's substantial advantages to being androgynous. So kids who are androgynous, so have both masculine and feminine characteristics, make less gender-typed choices for play and activities. They're better adjusted, they're more creative, and they actually have higher self-esteem, at least compared to those who just have feminine characteristics. So we've kind of dichotomized this, but I think it's important to keep in mind that it's not necessarily just learning to be male or just learning to be female. And that's the end of this lecture.